Good morning, everyone. Oh, you can't all chorus back good morning to you, but I see people nodding, and I'll pretend that that's happening. I'll get waves from our panelists. I want to thank everyone for being here this morning, or if you're coming in from other parts of the world at whatever time it is you're joining us today. So thanks to everyone for coming to this session. As you know, this is going to be Literary Afrofuturism in the 21st Century. I'm the moderator. I'm Isiah Lavender. I'm a Regents Professor of Science Fiction Studies at Georgia Tech, and I'm going to be moderating this conversation. So we're actually going to do a little bit more of a lightning presentation style rather than a roundtable, because we realize since we can't all be together, we can't hand you copies of our book to leaf through. So we're going to have to instead give you the sort of audio or verbal version of that with our presentations. And then we hope that you'll check the books out online or perhaps even in person eventually. Okay, great. So here's how things are going to go today. I'm going to introduce each speaker, and then I'm going to give them time to present their ideas. And that's going to take about 5 to 10 minutes for each speaker. After all of the speakers have presented, I'm going to open up the floor for questions and comments using that Q&A feature that Jason was talking about earlier and that you can find at the bottom of your Zoom client. So during this session, I want to invite you to start writing in your questions. And if you're interested, you can use the Zoom function to upvote other people's questions as well. And then once we've all presented, I'll start to take those questions from the chat feature and we'll move on, or from the Q&A feature, and we'll move on from there. Okay, great. Is screen sharing is disabled? Oh, it is for us? I hope not.
Working on it.
Okay. Turning it on, great, thank you, good. All right, so again, I'm Isiah Lavender. I'm a Regents Professor of Science Fiction Studies at Georgia Tech, and I'm going to kick things off by just giving you a little bit of background about the book and talking about a couple of my favorite attributes. All right, let's see if we can get the screen share to work here. All right, I have to go into my privacy and security here apparently to allow this to happen. Okay. Let's see if that works. Great. All right, wonderful. Okay, here, oops, and we are at the wrong slide. Let me get to the correct slide and we will get started. Great. Okay, again, so for those of you who may have missed the first few minutes, this is the panel on literary Afrofuturism in the 21st century. I'm the moderator, Professor Isiah Lavender, and really excited to have this opportunity to start this conference by sharing this book with you. It's an anthology of essays, of scholarly essays about, as much as the title suggests, literary Afrofuturism in the 21st century. And it's put together by what I think are some of the most exciting, both established voices in science fiction studies and some of the most exciting up and coming ones as well. So the book itself, Isiah and I had the idea for doing this book, back in about 2015, 2016, when we realized we were coming up on the 25th anniversary of science fiction, or rather of what people are now calling Afrofuturism. And we were thinking about how in science fiction, every 20 or 25 years, you tend to have a movement, and then it becomes less important and other things take their place. And we started to wonder if Afrofuturism was going to operate like other modes of science fiction, or because it is its own aesthetic phenomena, if it would evolve in different ways. And this book was our attempt to explore that question. So like I said, so in the introduction, we talk a little bit about that the goal of the book is to celebrate 25 years of scholars and artists and really even everyday people trying to think through what is the meaning and value of Afrofuturism as both a historical and a global phenomena. So one of the things I really enjoyed doing when we were putting this book together was actually the introduction. I'm a cultural historian and I'm such a dork. I love going back through the history of academia and of literature and their various subdisciplines and subgenres. And one of the cool things that I got to think about was the fact that Afrofuturism isn't just this monolithic thing, but we can really think about it as a phenomenon that occurs in waves. and that there are different conversations happening in each wave. So I've marked some of these out here on the slide for you. And so we started thinking about Afrofuturism, of course, with Mark Derry in 1992. And that's really the sort of opening gambit to look at how it is that authors of color, especially authors from the Atlantic, are using science fiction and fantasy and horror to create these counter narratives of science, technology, and race. By 2013, Ronaldo Anderson is also starting to think about the differences or the possibility that Afrofuturism might evolve. And so he starts looking at how it's become not just a literary or aesthetic phenomena, but a much larger cultural phenomena that also informs metaphysics, philosophy, religion, and activism. And then finally, the thing that we've seen most recently in the last couple of years is speculation about Afrofuturism 3.0. And again, Anderson coined that term, and that's thinking about, if, how, and when Afrofuturist and African science fiction projects overlap. And what's interesting is I would just note that this is not just a scholarly or academic debate. I know from my work with the State of Black Science Fiction artists who are located in Atlanta that they've been working off and on with African artists to do anthologies. And actually, I think that they've just put out a new anthology. I wish I could remember the name. I'll look later and put it in the chat for you all. But that it's been a really interesting process because there sort of is this assumption that there's global Blackness and everyone has the same concerns. But of course, surprise, surprise, just like, British people or Muslims or science fiction fans themselves, lots of different people with lots of different ideas about how to imagine the future in full color. The other thing I loved about doing the introduction was finding out how many people disliked the word Afrofuturism and came up with other names for Black science fiction. So I've listed a few of my favorite ones here, and you'll see various authors and scholars talking about these terms within the anthology. So I'm not going to say any more about them now, except that Imhotep, which is very difficult to say, is by far my favorite of the names. We can talk about this later if you'd like. All right. The other thing that I thought was really cool is that we got the opportunity to include an artists roundtable in the anthology. So while it was a scholarly anthology, we also wanted to hear what artists had to say about the kinds of issues that we were exploring in the book. So we pulled together 7 Afrofuturist and or African science fiction authors to speak with us. So let me go. I don't think I put anyone's names on here. So in case you don't know who these people are, if going across top to bottom and then left to right, we have Nalo Hopkinson, N.K. Jemison, Nisi Shaw, Minister Faust, Chinelo Onwalu, Nick Wood, and Bill Campbell. And it's really nice because these are authors who are from all over the place. Nalo is a Caribbean Canadian author currently living in the US. Nisi, Nora, and Bill Campbell, they're all Americans. Minister Faust is a Kenyan Canadian. Chinelo Onwalu is a Nigerian currently living in Toronto, and Nick Wood is a South African currently living in England. So it was really exciting to get such a diverse range of voices into that roundtable, and especially ones who are all so smart and funny. Everyone always had some amazing line that we could use as the end point for each section. So I hope that if you get a chance to check out the book, that you'll really pay some special attention to that roundtable, because our authors did a fantastic job both entertaining and instructing. All right, and then finally, I'm going to hand things off here in a minute. But the last thing I wanted to talk about is really quickly, I just wanted to let you know, as you're listening to our panelists today, these are all amazing people who've done amazing work, and I hope that you'll check out, of course, both our anthology, Literary Afrofuturism, but also some of the work that my colleagues here have done. So for instance, we have Rebecca Holden's anthology, edited with Nisi Shaw, Strange Matings. We have Nedine Moonsamy's novel, which was just published very recently, last year. So congratulations to Nedine. And this is very exciting because, as Nedine said, it's not about science fiction or America. And I said, that's why it's so exciting. A nice break from the things I usually do. We have Isiah's newest book, Afrofuturism Rising, which is a prehistory of Afrofuturism, beginning with Phyllis Wheatley. And then finally, my book, The Future is Female, which was an anthology of women science fiction writers from the 20s to the 60s. And although I wasn't able to include any women of color for a variety of reasons, mostly because there simply weren't any self-identified women of color from that period we were looking at, I'm excited. I literally just got the contract for The Future is Female Forever, and we're going to be looking at feminist science fiction of the 1970s, where we really are going to be able to begin to show futures in full color. So that's going to be exciting. All right. And then just finally, really quickly, Isiah and I this year also edited a special edition of Extrapolation called Beyond Afrofuturism. And this was originally supposed to be part of literary Afrofuturism. The project got so big it had to be divided and taken to different places. So while literary Afrofuturism is about what is the past and present and future of Afrofuturism, Beyond Afrofuturism looks at what are all the other amazing ways that people are exploring science, technology, and race outside of the subgenre, sometimes affectionately and sometimes horrifyingly known as Afrofuturism. And if nothing else, I'd like to sell that one because it concludes with an essay by Sam Delaney that makes the most puckish and interesting argument about the roots of Afrofuturism that I have ever seen. But what else would we expect of Samuel Delaney? Okay, I've talked for so long and I'm happy now to move on. Our next panelist is going to be Rebecca Holden. And Rebecca is a senior lecturer at the University of Maryland. So Rebecca, please take it away.
All right, can everyone hear me okay? All right, so I'm gonna go ahead and try to share my screen. We'll see how this works. Hold on one second. This is the benefit of all right, can you guys see this lovely Prezi? Is it okay? Great. All right, I'm gonna go fast through the first couple of slides, and again, let me know if you're having trouble seeing anything or hearing me or anything like that. So my piece was looking at YA Afrofuturism, and my subtitle is Rewriting the Curriculum, and we'll get to that in just a second. I'm gonna start my timer because my goal is really to talk for like 5 minutes so that we can have questions and conversations later. So this was something that I was really interested in. As Lisa mentioned, I have done a lot of work on Octavia Butler. I've also done a lot of work on other African-American science fiction writers. And I'm also interested in YA fiction in general. So this was a chance for me to sort of put two of my interests together, as well as I like feminist science fiction is my other thing. So they all kind of come together a little bit. So I'm going to go ahead and see if I can, whoa, that's not what I meant to do at all. Hold on. There we go. Sorry, I don't want to make you sick here. All right, so this is a quote from one of my books that I looked at, and this is a book by Eliah Don Johnson, who's actually speaking in a panel later today. So hopefully everyone will get a chance to go and hear her read today. And this is from her book, The Summer Prince. And the notion is that art that changes nothing at all wouldn't really be art, would it? And this is from her character, the young artist June Costa in The Summer Prince. And that's sort of a driving feature for me in looking at why Afrofuturism and also literature in general is art that changes nothing wouldn't really be art, right? So I'm looking at things that are transformative because that's what's really interesting to me about science fiction in general and Afrofuturism as well, is that it's transformative. So just a little bit about the history of YA literature and its didactic function. So YA literature hasn't been around for that long, really. So in the 50s is the first time you hear people talking about YA or young adult literature, and here's an early definition. And it became not into regular use in libraries until about 1978. And that's probably where it really started, was in libraries. People were classing fiction as YA or young adult fiction. Usually The Outsiders by S.E. Hinton from 1967 is sort of seen as the first YA novel. It's not really, but it's the one that people point to. So just like children's literature, YA literature really does have a didactic function. It's meant to teach. And I've got a quote here focusing on utopian and dystopian writing for children and young adults. And basically, even with speculative YA, it is meant to teach. And it's got a lot of different things. I have some different YA and children's books here in the Prezi. All right, so now we get to what I was looking at here, Afrofuturism and YASF and fantasy. And when I went out and started reading, because that's the first thing I do is I go out and just read. I'm going to read everything I can find because, of course, I love to read anyway, and it's another chance for me to read YA Afrofuturism. Why not? So I went out and found and read as much as I can. As Isiah and Lisa can tell you, my first draft was huge. And they said, okay, we got to cut this in half. So that's what I did. And then I ended up focusing on 3 novels in this piece. And I'm going to briefly just introduce the 3 novels and just have 1 or 2 notes on those. And so I'm hoping that you go out and read these novels if you haven't yet, as well as go out and you can see what is in the book or what my conclusions were. But I'm just going to give you just a little bit of a taste from each of them. So the first book I looked at was A Shadow Speaker by Nedine Moonsamy. And this is a book that's set in a future Niger, which right now is, of course, one of the poorest nations in Africa. And it's a retelling of a future there. And it's really focused on what I think it's focused on is reformulating history. Whose history do we tell? Is history linear? What kind of science? So we're looking at the history of science for a particular nation or people. What do we privilege, right? And what do we accept as fact or not fact? So those are all questions that I think that Okorafor is really looking at in this book and coming up with some pretty interesting new lessons, right? In terms of how we look at history, how we reformulate history. The next book I looked at was Walter Mosley's 47. And again, these are all wonderful books. So I always encourage people to go out and read these books. And in this one, I really focus on how Mosley is revising oral traditions and folktales. And one of the things that I said about this, and it has to do with another book of Okorafor's, is that it's not anyone's grandmother's slave narrative. So in this book, Mosley is combining slave narrative, science fiction, aliens, as well as folktales. So there's a lot going on in this book. And it ends up being about really how we can see outside the realm of possibility and what that can teach us about the past, the present, and the future, as well as the kind of folk tales that we want to tell and we want children to learn, right? And we want them to see. The last book I looked at was The Summer Prince, as I mentioned before, by Isiah Johnson. And again, hopefully you guys can come hear her read this afternoon. She's a wonderful writer, and this book is really complex. And that's another thing I wanted to share with people is that YA literature is not simplistic. Some people think, oh, YA, that's really simple. That's, for young kids. It can be very complex. And I think that this novel is a particularly good example of a very complex YA book. And in this book, it's really focusing on art. So it has histories and folktales and music, but how that can be remade into transformative art. So one of the questions I see here is what happens when previous readings and retellings don't hold any longer? When do we have to change? We can't be stagnant. And then how can art be used to truly transform a society? And again, this is a really fascinating story set in sort of a reimagined futuristic Brazil. So I'm at about 6 minutes, so I'm going to stop with this last quote from Johnson. We need diverse stories. We need a million mirrors of different shapes and sizes, not just so we can see ourselves, so that they can see us through our own eyes. And I will end there.
All right, thank you so much, Rebecca. That was wonderful. Next up, we're going to have Nedine Moonsamy, who is Senior Lecturer in the English Department at the University of Pretoria. Nedine, take it away.
Hi, everyone. I trust that you can hear me okay and that you can see my slideshow. Great. Okay. So I've committed to paper, so I shouldn't take up too much time. And my contribution to the volume was a very focused, close reading on Amos Tutola's The Palm Wine Drinkard. So in 1952, The Palm Wine Drinkard became the first West African novel to be published in English, and then more importantly, to be published internationally. And the fact that this book was written by a fairly illiterate Nigerian desk clerk who simply took to writing to alleviate his boredom meant that the book actually caused a large stir and was quite controversial when it was initially published. I think today still the book is quite, I think, debated within the canon of African literature. But I think has nevertheless gone on to become celebrated as a kind of exemplar of African fantasy. But in my article, and I think it tacks on to more recent debates around the novel, where we see that there is a revisiting of this label of Africa as a fabulous, Amos Tutola as an African fabulist or a writer of fantasy. So there is some understanding now that maybe this label is fairly patronizing or pejorative, because he's not actually writing fantasy, and his work actually is quite empirically embedded in what we can think of as an African reality. And so similarly, I think my reading of the novel then goes on to explore how we can actually more suitably start to classify this novel as a pioneering work of African science fiction rather than an example of African fantasy. And a lot of this has to do with the way Tutola uses language. So perhaps I think before I actually engage with this argument, it might make sense to tell you a little bit about the novel itself. So let's just get to my next slide. So while I just take you through the actual events that take place in the novel, this is simply an intertextual reproduction of the palm wine drinkard as a comic strip. Okay, so the palm wine drinkard introduces us to the main protagonist, who is the drinkard himself. And he is a very nonchalant, chilled character who passes his time drinking palm wine with his friends. However, one day we see that his tapster dies after falling off a tree, and then because he no longer has access to palm wine, that means all of his friends quickly disappear and all of his bonhomie ends. And so consequently, the drinkard seeks to remedy the situation by trying to retrieve his tapster from a place in the novel that's called Deadstown, because this is where all the dead people in the novel go. And so he embarks on a quest, and he passes through many strange towns, and he meets a bunch of bizarre characters as a result of this journey. And eventually he is reunited with his dead tapster. But unfortunately, as he finds out, a dead person can't leave Deadstown. So quite bereft then, the drinkard has to return home without his drinkard. But we see that he has matured as a result of his journey. And so he's no longer this nonchalant drunkard, but actually goes on to demonstrate a great sense of civic duty in his community. And he actually ends up bringing an end to the famine in the village. And so, as I mentioned, there was a large controversy regarding this novel when it was initially published. And so Western critics on the one hand hailed the palm wine drinkard as a kind of inventive and avant-garde novel. But we see on the other hand, Nigerian critics, I think, were quite puzzled and even embarrassed by Tutola's use of English. And they argued that no such English existed, not even in a purely spoken form or in a pidgin form. And so nevertheless, in my contribution, and I think, just moving this argument along, we can put this literary debate aside because I think inevitably we can agree that Tutola's very striking use of language is undoubtedly sublime. And so then nevertheless is then able to transport the reader in ways that are in fact quite crucial and expected for a genre like science fiction. And so the argument that I pursue in my close reading of the palm wine drinkard is that, Tutola does in fact take great pains to place this narrative, within a lived and I think a believable African reality that is in fact more in line then with science fiction rather than fantasy. And so in order to make this argument, I rely on Samuel Delany, which I think maybe some people might find counterintuitive, but perhaps we can talk about this point in the discussion later if there's time. And so simply Samuel Delany argues that, science fiction is in fact able to generate a sense of infantile wonder for the reader through language. And I think this becomes an interesting springboard for my argument coming out of this hallmark essay, which is about 5,750 words. because here we see that Delaney makes this very insightful argument about how science fiction is in fact quite distinct from other types of fiction. So he says, whereas realism tells you what could have happened and fantasy explores what, what could not have happened, we see that science fiction tells us something about what hasn't necessarily happened yet. And so, he uses what I think is now a very famous example of the winged dog here, where he says, as reportage, this phrase just simply doesn't connect. It doesn't allow us to arrive at an idea or an image, and the same applies with naturalistic fiction. Whereas if we translate this phrase into the genre of fantasy, we might come out with a creature, something like the one I've placed in the corner, something quite celestial or ethereal in nature. However, he argues when we carry this idea of a winged dog across into science fiction, we can in fact arrive at an idea or an image, but the reproduction or the results are always quite modest in nature, because the building blocks that we have to use in generating science fiction ideas or products is empirical in nature. So, ultimately the point is here that fantasy allows the imagination to travel anywhere and everywhere, but science fiction, I think, approaches the world with an inventive attitude rather than a fanciful one. And so science fiction then can stretch outside of our current world, but never to the same extent that fantasy can. And so as Delaney then explains, science fiction writers very carefully use language then as this process of modification that helps the imagination make a leap from our world into an alternative one. And so using this, I go on to argue that we can in fact read this, what we can almost think of as a balancing act being performed in Totola's use of language. And so we can just very quickly, I think, talk through these examples, where here he says, the drinkard explains that he and his wife have become immortal because they had sold out death to somebody at the door for a sum of 70 pounds and 18 shillings and 6 pence, and lent out fiat to somebody at the door, as well as on interest for 3 pounds, 10 shillings and 0 pence per month. And so we did not care about our death and we did not fear again. So here we see that Totola is in fact, he's imagining this refreshing option for us where a state of existence like death and anxiety, much like everything else in our consumerist culture, can be traded or rented or worn, much like clothing. So giving the exact amounts in British pounds here as well, I think marries something as familiar as consumerist or trade culture, like shopping, I think, with this wondrous potential that we may in fact one day discard existential inconveniences as easily as that. And so maybe just very quickly looking at the last example, we see that again, for every fantastic suggestion, Totola provides a real world equivalent. He places, and then as a result, he is able to place these bizarre creatures within the limits of our current experience. So in the forest, the drinkard meets a creature whose 2 large eyes were as big as bowls and who had feet as long and thick as a pillar of a house. So as I suggest, these, this reliance on similes or mundane comparisons is in fact part of an effort to weave what is the fanciful world that he presents to us, but marrying it and blending it into the reader's reality. So that's just basically what my close reading performs in the article, is this idea that the palm wine drinker does in fact use language in ways that critics like Delaney insist are in fact universally crucial to science fiction. And so then obviously out of this close reading comes an argument, or maybe I think a point for further probing, where I suggest that, in contemporary appraisals of science fiction in Africa, there is, I think, a tendency or growing tendency to argue that the genre is rooted in indigenous fable and folklore. And so consequently, it should be read in unique and I think sometimes exceptionalist terms. Yet I think reading science fiction as an exclusive and maybe even sometimes resistant form of science fiction, then makes us lose sight of the fact that sometimes, popular culture does in fact work on a global and a globalizing level. And so, as I've shown in this article, there's this wielding of language as this ultimate form of technology that Tutola in fact uses in his novel. And consequently, we then can read this as science fiction and as a worthy participant on a global stage of popular genre fiction. So yeah, I think I will stop there.
All right, thank you so much, Nedine. That was wonderful. And then finally, last but certainly not least, we have Isiah Lavender, who is the Sterling Goodman Professor of English at the University of Georgia and my co-editor for this volume. Isiah, the floor is yours.
All right. Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are on planet Earth, right? I'm hopeful that my PowerPoint presentation is going to work pretty well. Let me try and get this thing going. Okay, so wokeness and Afrofuturism. We began this collection with the alarm Richard Wright sounded 80 years ago in his searing American classic Native Son. Not much has seemed to have changed. We wanted readers to wake up and stay woke, just like Wright asked of his own audience. We wanted to make conscious the utility of Afrofuturism as a critical term in the battle to state claims for people of color and people of all colors in the future imaginary. More than mere intellectual sparring, this seemingly abstract aesthetic battle is of the utmost importance in an historical moment when people of color are rising and finding themselves, once again, facing a resurgence of white supremacist anger. The word Afrofuturism was only coined in 1993, but it refers to cultural works from the 19th century to the present. The mainstream of science fiction and futuristic speculation, at least in an Anglo-American context, has largely been centered on white people. Afrofuturist creators seek to envision futures that contain Black people and that allow for Black cultural expression outside the white supremacist parameters that define consensus reality. Indeed, just as white science fiction writers have long imagined alternative pasts and strange new futures, so too Afrofuturists have reimagined the past and envisioned marvelous new futures, although in this case with a special political goal: to turn both against the oppressions of the actual present. With important scholarly works that concentrate on technology, sound, and image, like Reynaldo Anderson and Charles E. Jones's Afrofuturism 2.0, The Rise of Astro-Blackness, Paul Youngquist's A Pure Solar World, Sun Ra and the Birth of Afrofuturism, and Eric Steinskog's Afrofuturism and Black Sound Studies, Culture, Technology, and Things to Come, we thought it important to concentrate on the genre we know best in this collection, literature. We also like to think that we have achieved our goal in showcasing the best new scholarship on Afrofuturism in the 21st century, aesthetic and critical practice. While Afrofuturism has always been a multimedia aesthetic movement, the authors in this volume complement and extend such scholarship by demonstrating the historical and contemporary centrality of print-based storytelling to Afrofuturism. At the same time, their use of diverse critical perspectives enable them to ask hard questions about who and what counts as Afrofuturism, questions that have become increasingly important to artists and scholars alike as stories about science, technology, race, and futurity become increasingly central to the public imagination. We are exceedingly excited to feature interior art by the wonderful Stacy Robinson that I hope you see slowly cycling on the PowerPoint. These images are the colored versions of the black and white ones in our collection and represent our way of acknowledging the fantastic Afrofuturist artwork being done right now. We are tremendously thrilled to present an author roundtable with well-known and emerging writers so our audience can learn their opinions about overly loose uses of the term and about the relations of its African-American focus to the African diaspora and literary production within Africa itself. Afrofuturism is increasingly misapplied to any and all works of Black speculative fiction, regardless of where their authors come from or what issues they address. Without doubt, African futurism, as Nnedi Okorafor calls it, exists in its own right, and we very much look forward to a new generation of artists and scholars who will explore in depth. Like pioneering Afrofuturist author and editor Cherie Thomas, we are very excited by what's over the horizon, and we absolutely were thrilled by having her write about what she sees as important to Afrofuturism right now, the contribution of Black women writers to this ongoing colored wave of science fiction. Certainly, we are pleased to include a range of different voices in this collection and hope others recognize the contribution this kind of work makes to science fiction scholarship, which needs to be as diverse as science fiction itself. We have sought to craft a strong editorial framework for this book that will make it accessible to the widest range of audiences possible, whatever their disciplinary background or level of scholarly expertise, as we amplify the study of Afrofuturism across time and space. While it is true that Africa is a vast continent with a diverse range of speculative traditions, the study of these traditions is still very new, and we are delighted that we were able to recruit some up-and-coming African science fiction writers and scholars alike for this project. Our main regret with this collection is that we simply did not have the space to imagine what lies beyond Afrofuturism. The term has been around for a quarter century now, and we are keenly interested in the question of what might coexist with or go beyond Afrofuturism. But as students of genre history well know, every 2 to 3 decades, there is a sea change as the science fiction community redefines the thematic and stylistic concerns of good science fiction, and in doing so paves the way for new modes of speculative storytelling. So it's only natural to ask, is Afrofuturism a colored wave within science fiction history, analogous to aesthetic movements such as the New Wave or cyberpunk? Or might its multi-genre status provide some kind of energy that transcends and transforms science fiction history as we know it? We believe it is the latter, and so we say, welcome to the colored age of science fiction and fantasy. Welcome to the emancipatory landscapes of social justice and alternative futurisms. Get woke and stay woke. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Isiah, so much for that. Actually, for some reason, your screen didn't share and cycle, but if you wanted to go and do that now while we're doing the Q&A, that would be perfectly appropriate as well, and then everyone can enjoy Stacy's work.
Well, let's see it.
There you go. There you go.
Oh,
yeah.
A technical snafu on my end. Apologies.
That's all right. Why don't you get it queued up there for yourself?
Okay.
And if you want to get the pictures rotating, that'd be wonderful. Or do you have anything you want to say before we go to questions about the?
I can only shake my head in shame.
Okay. Fair enough. I wouldn't be ashamed. I would just say, you know, it's a process, right? We're all learning how to do these conferences online. All right, great. So hopefully Isiah will be able to advance his slides and you can see some of the work that Stacy did as part of his work with Black Kirby, which is the artist group that he does with John Jennings. And they are the artists in residence for Ohio State University Press's New Sons book line. And this book is in the New Sons book line. So we were really excited to have them doing this work for us, and especially having Stacy do some interior art to match each of the sections. So, okay, we've got some questions. This is exciting. I can stop talking. I'll read them out. And then, okay, so the first question is from Joy Sanchez Taylor. It says, thank you all for such interesting presentations. I have 2 questions for Lisa. What were the reasons you encountered for why some people hate the term Afrofuturism? Isiah, you can help out with this one too. Also, is the author's roundtable in literary Afrofuturism recorded? Can this recording be released at some point? I'm going to take the last question first because that's the easier one. Joy, what a great idea. If only we had recorded it. It was actually an asynchronous email conversation, which was, you know, unfortunate because we weren't able to get a live recording or get the authors bouncing off each other. But the advantage was that it gave everyone a lot of time to sort of think about and polish their responses. So I'm sorry there's no recording. But you know what? Maybe someday we could like get people to dramatically enact it, and then we could record it and put it on YouTube. I think that would be, everyone's laughing. That's what we should do. Joy, see if you've got students who would help with that. That'd be hilarious. Or if anyone wants to volunteer. I don't even know if this is legal, but that's my suggestion.
No.
And go on, Isiah.
Lisa, I was going to say, yeah, we came up with a list of questions that we sent out to all the authors, and some took a day or two, others a week or two, and then we sent them out to each other to see if they wanted to expand on it. And you know, it was a pretty good time. We were able to build connections between them, though you have to believe that that community is, you know, they mostly know each other already, which made it kind of fun. In terms of people struggling with the definition of Afrofuturism, I think there's resistance to the creator of it in some ways, to Mark Derry defining it, and people having issue with the color of his skin in a basic sense, and other people trying to reclaim the term or invent new ones to help us think in different directions. And you know, it's shameful in some ways that we feel that way, but it's such a useful term. But you have to expect there to be some kind of cultural backlash because we didn't think of it first, unfortunately. And so the world has moved it. It's been coined. It's going to be referenced anytime the study of African American science fiction production comes up, which is why you have Nedine Moonsamy with African Futurism, one word, making it impossible to break, in referencing speculative fiction from the African continent, though she herself has faced a little bit of backlash on that front because they think of her as a first generation Nigerian American and maybe not completely Nigerian, which is, you know, what can I say? We can get into identity politics if you want. It looks like all of the artwork and stills from our book have now cycled through. So I'm going to share that sharing. I'm going to turn that off, I should say, I hope.
Okay.
And that should.
So I hate to say this, but we are actually already at 9:55, and I'm so sorry. Taryn Saint has two marvelous questions that I'm not sure if we have time to answer. So
hey, Lisa?
Taryn, perhaps, yeah, Jason.
Yeah, why don't y'all go ahead and hit one of those questions?
Okay, great. So we've got a question about, is there a possible convergence between Afrofuturism and solar punk? And then another question about, is there an element of cognitive estrangement in the palm wine drinkard? Would this be crucial to an understanding of Totola's novel as science fiction? So I'm gonna say Rebecca and Nedine, if you guys wanna talk about either Afrofuturism and solar punk or the palm wine drinkard, that would be great.
Jump in and say one thing because I want Nedine to talk about her book, and that's that a lot of these, I wanted to say hi to my students because I have a number of students I see out there, and Nedine did a great job of talking about stuff that's very relevant to my class in terms of definitions of science fiction, and this hits on definitions of Afrofuturism too. So I think that this idea of cognitive estrangement is really an important one and a key one, and one that we've talked about in my class, as well as to how wide do you make that definition, how narrow, and what is the importance of definitions, which I think gets at what a lot of us are talking about when we look at science fiction and Afrofuturism, or other names that we might want to apply to it.
Cool.
Yeah.
So thank you for the question, Tarun. I would say that we can definitely read cognitive estrangement in the palm wine drinkard. I think that would be a very compelling way to, I think, develop the argument that I was pursuing. So yes, I think that would be a way of growing that argument. I think that's the short answer.
All right. So I wish we had time to talk about Afrofuturism and solar punk, but I'm going to say really quickly, lightning answer, everyone, is there a possible convergence between Afrofuturism and solar punk? Rebecca, what do you say?
Yes. And I can't really explain. I mean, and this gets at this idea of definitions and about how to incorporate or talk about how things fit in different areas. And I think that there certainly could be.
Okay, great.
Happening in River Solomon, the unkindness of ghosts, if you're looking for a convergence of solar punk and Afrofuturism, and slave narrative, neo-slave narrative, if you want to call it that too, with an artificial sun on a generation starship traveling between the stars, trying to get to a new planet. And I think it's kind of fascinating. I just happen to be reading it, and so I think it's happening right there. River Solomon and unkindness of ghosts.
Yes, good. Nedine?
Yeah, I tend to agree. I'm also starting to pursue that idea in relation to like African urbanism, like an African futurism and urbanism. I definitely see a convergence happening there.
Yeah, that's cool. And I think that we see it all the way back. Let me do my cultural historian thing. All the way back to 28, Roger Sherman Tracy's The White Man's Burden, which imagines a world where essentially the West devolves into barbarism and Africa rises as the technological might of the future. And it's very much about using domes and harnessing solar power to build that civilization. I think it's a North African civilization, I can't remember, but I think there's a precedence for thinking about the relationship between solar punk and race and science and technology, 100%. All right, so we should absolutely go and let Jason get on to the next panel. Thank you all for being here bright and early or late in the day, whichever it was. And thanks to my marvelous panelists for being here.
Thank you.
I'm applauding you all.
Thanks, guys.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Bye-bye, thanks.
Hey, thank you all so much, Lisa, Rebecca, Isiah, and Nedine. This is a really great session. We're going to set up very quickly for the next session, which is on pedagogy, with moderator Jill Balai, Doug Davis, Sadia Reza, and Peter Sands. So how about, let's say we're going to reconvene in about 2 to 3 minutes. I know we're running a little behind, but I think we can make things up as we go along.